If I told you I saw a living, breathing unicorn, you should not believe me. However, if I told you I saw a living, breathing dog, you should believe me. This is because even though I have not provided any explicit empirical evidence for either the dog or the unicorn in the previous statements, we have an abundance of implicit empirical evidence for the dog from the applied and natural sciences. For example, we know the phylogeny, the taxonomy, the chemical makeup, the genetic composition, and many other empirical factors of what makes up a dog. Therefore, I don't need to provide any explicit empirical evidence for the dog because it already has an abundance of implicit empirical evidence, whereas unicorns have neither. So in order for unicorns to be reasonable to believe based on testimony, you would need to provide explicit empirical evidence for unicorns. This example outlines two of the three tiers of knowledge: the conceptual tier of stuff in our heads and the empirical tier of stuff in the physical world around us. For a more detailed guide about the tiers of knowledge, check out my first video. Personal experience, intuition, eyewitness testimony, and anecdote would all be forms of conceptual evidence. Imagination, delusion, misconception, invention, and intention would all be forms of conceptual conclusions. Conceptual claims require conceptual evidence. Therefore, it would be reasonable to believe me if I said I am imagining a unicorn, because I haven't made any claims about what's going on in the physical world around us, and I've only been making claims about what's going on in my head. Empirical evidence would include testable, falsifiable, verifiable, and observable things, essentially stuff verified by the natural and applied sciences. An empirical claim or conclusion would essentially be claiming something exists in the physical world we perceive around us, such as a living, breathing animal. Because empirical claims require empirical evidence, it would only be reasonable to believe me if I made a claim about a living, breathing animal if empirical evidence existed for that living, breathing animal. Therefore, if I told you I saw conceptual evidence, a real living, breathing unicorn empirical claim, you should not believe me. However, if I told you I saw conceptual evidence, a real living, breathing dog empirical claim, then you should believe me, because dogs have an implicit empirical basis. Historical claims are a form of conceptual evidence, therefore they work in the same way. If there already exists an implicit empirical basis for the historical claim, then it is prima facie reasonable to accept. If there is no implicit empirical evidence, then explicit empirical evidence must be provided before it would be reasonable to believe based on testimony alone. However, conceptual claims that do not have an empirical basis would be reasonable to believe are delusions, misconceptions, or inventions, because those are only conceptual conclusions and they only require conceptual evidence, such as testimony. A similar argument was presented by David Hume and Christopher Hitchens. There is not to be found in all history any miracle attested by a sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us against all delusion in themselves.
If you meet someone in the street who you yesterday saw executed, you can say either that an extraordinary miracle has occurred or that you are under a very grave misapprehension. And David Hume's logic on this, I think, is quite irrefutable. He says, what is more likely, that the laws of nature have been suspended in your favor and in a way that you approve, or that you've made a mistake?
Neither Christopher Hitchens nor David Hume were historians, so what do historians have to say? In his paper Historians and Miracle Claims, Michael Licona, a Christian historian, says, most biblical scholars and historians hold that the investigation of a miracle report lies outside of the rights of a historian acting within their professional capacity. Later in his same paper, he quotes Robert Webb's justification for this position. It's a rather long quote, so I'll just put it up on the screen and you can pause it and read it for yourself. Therefore, it is unreasonable to believe any claims about miracles, magic, mythical creatures, UFOs, the paranormal, the supernatural, from any form of conceptual evidence, such as historical testimony, eyewitness testimony, anecdote, or personal experience. A common apologist's response to these types of arguments is that if they are true, all history is unreliable. That would not apply in the case of my argument, because my argument only applies to things that lack an implicit empirical basis, whereas pretty much everything we believe about history has an implicit empirical basis. The only things that really definitely lack an implicit empirical basis are magic, miracles, mythical creatures, the supernatural, paranormal, aliens, and similar such claims. Therefore, only those would be excluded by this principle. It's important to note that historians have many other criteria for determining what we should believe about historical claims, and so it's not sufficient just to be empirically possible or to have an implicit empirical basis for it to be reasonable to believe a historical claim, which is why I claim it's only prima facie reasonable to accept such claims. As a final note, even if miracles did happen, such as the resurrection of Jesus, that would not be evidence to indicate a metaphysical conclusion like theism. That's because metaphysical conclusions require metaphysical evidence, and even if there's empirical evidence of the resurrection, that empirical evidence would not be sufficient. This is because any of the mutually exclusive metaphysical alternatives listed in my last video could all explain the resurrection of Jesus or any miracle. For example, the spaghetti monster can explain the resurrection of Jesus because the spaghetti monster may have sufficient reason to raise Jesus from the dead if that will cause more spaghetti to be produced at some point in the future. This is essentially analogous to Apologist's argument that an all-good God could allow evil because it may allow for some greater good in the future. To summarize, conceptual claims require conceptual evidence, empirical claims require empirical evidence, and metaphysical claims require metaphysical evidence. A similar principle has been stated by many before. As Hume phrased it, in our reasonings concerning matters of fact, there are all imaginable degrees of assurance. A wise man therefore proportions his belief to the evidence. As Carl Sagan put it, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And as Laplace put it, the weight of evidence for an extraordinary claim must be proportioned to its strangeness.